Hello, welcome to today's episode of The Knit Yorker. Today we're going to talk about knitting myths and misconceptions. And I'm not here to roast anyone for currently believing some of these things or maybe believing them in the past. I myself am at fault in the past to have believed some of this. In fact, I would even say that maybe some of these are the reason I even began knitting because I really thought it would be cheaper than buying clothes. Anyway, we'll get into that. Yeah, this video is just having fun and also maybe being a little bit informative, especially if you are watching as a non-knitter or someone who's interested in knitting, but you're not sure if it's for you or if what they say about knitting is true or not. In general, I've seen comments, or not just online, but also in my life, I've heard comments from people, especially once I started knitting more and everybody in my life became aware that I was knitting. The people in the common culture believe a lot of these and that they're portrayed on media, so that kind of just makes it even more into the common psyche of people. I'm getting riled up and I haven't even read any of them. I'm gonna start reading again some of the stuff that you guys submitted on my Instagram and on my knitting community tab. If you didn't catch that for this video, I post sometimes both on Instagram and on YouTube, so you can participate on the videos and tell me what you think, and I will be reading some of these today. So I think I'm gonna start with one of the most obvious ones that I think a lot of people actually believe and have said to my face, which is bizarre. That knitting is mainly a hobby for women and or grandmas. I mean, it's very obvious that this very broad statement is not true for a lot of reasons. One is that most broad statements are not true. And the second is that there's nothing about knitting that makes it female exclusive or certain age exclusive. Nothing, like literally nothing. It is just something in the psychological thinking of culture that is perpetuated by media. And I try to look into why the hell people think this in general. Why is knitting associated with being an old granny? And all I could find really is that in the turn of the 20th century, knitting was actually very popular, especially like in 20s, 30s. Before the war, during the war especially, it was super, super popular, and not just among women, but among everybody, especially in some countries. Like, children were taught to knit. In some countries, there's in Europe, in other places, they're still taught to knit since they're very small, because it is a skill. It's a skill and it's an art, just like other people are taught to weave or to paint or to do any other skill / art. Knitting is another thing that people learn. And not only that, but it was something useful that people could make clothing from to keep themselves warm in the winter, not only for their own families, but also to sell. A lot of, families lived off of the knitting that they produced, all of the family. And the idea of it being more of a granny hobby, I think, seems to come from after the war and when women were staying at home more. I'm talking about Western culture more than anything. Women staying at home more, kind of being forced to, honestly. The older people that had this skill for a while were still, knitting. And it just, I feel like, started being associated with that, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where knitting kind of fell out of fashion a little bit, and just in general in fashion, it started to be seen a little more like that idea of the clunky, 80s knit and not very fashionable, and it wasn't in general. It is after the 90s that a lot of knitters, started creating more community, thank you to the internet, but in general, it was just not as fashionable. And it started to be associated with old women, probably, again, because they're the ones that had that skill already. And maybe they were passing it down, but if it's not popular and not passing it down as much, is probably what happened. I just want to end with saying there's nothing wrong with older white women knitting and of grannies even knitting. In fact, some grannies are some of the best knitters out there. But I think the idea of it being an exclusively female hobby, when, female hobbies in general are looked down upon by society as something more or less useless or less in general, and it's a hobby, it's not an art, and all of that stuff. And I look at it, it's like, my granny used to knit sweaters. I hear that all the time. My granny used to knit. Oh, you remind me of my granny. It's like, I bet your granny was really cool, and I'm glad I remind you of her. But a lot of people knit, and you can knit too. And that kind of brings me up until my next misconception or myth, which is, I could never do that, or I could never knit a sweater, or I could never learn to do what you're doing. I could never knit. Well, any statement like that from people, I know it's a little something more personal, and people know their abilities more than others, but it's not that knitting is easy. I think the skill of knitting is accessible. And what I mean by this is not that knitting is cheap, but that all you need to learn to knit are 2 sticks and some string. That's pretty much it. Like, you're not gonna end up knitting this amazing sweater, and it's not gonna be maybe the best ever, but it's really all you knit. A few months ago, I taught a friend's daughter who was around 8 or 9 to knit. She really wanted to learn, and I volunteered to knit, and I spent few hours in our house just teaching her, and we went to get some materials to get it, and I told her, like, just get some bamboo needles and any yarn she wants, and that's pretty much all she will need to learn. And my friend was kind of surprised, like, really, that's it? That's all she needs? Like, there's nothing else I need to get? Not really. I mean, I have friends who told me that they learned to knit as kids with 2 pencils, or even with chopsticks, and with whatever string they could find. Because in the end, you're just using the needles to create, the knitting fabric, and they are very set skills. Like, there are many ways to knit, but in the end, you're just creating fabric, and there are some basics. And I think anyone can learn those basics. Now, being able to follow a pattern, being able to have the right tension, or be like, some people are definitely more naturally skilled or at having a more even tension, or just that learning the motions in general that may have more dexterity at it. That's something else. And of course, that's not easy. But I do think that anyone can knit, and anyone can learn to knit if they really want to. And then just having that statement, just straight up say, I could never do that. I'm not even gonna try. That looks so hard. I think it's very negative, and honestly not true. So when people tell me that, I always say, yes, you could. And if you wanted to, I could teach you, and we could sit down, and I promise you will learn. And usually they're like, no. I don't know, maybe like kind of get a little bit scared by that response, but I really do believe that it's not true, and anyone can learn. Now, for other misconceptions that were sent by some of my followers, we also got, everything made with yarn is knitted. Big one. And I think that comes especially from the frustrated thing of hearing that, or seeing something crochet and people calling it knit, or seeing something weaved and people calling it knit. I think in the psyche of the general public, anything made with yarn means knitting, regardless of how it's made. And that's not true, because it just isn't. Like, there are different skills and different ways of making things, and specifically talking about knitting, but some people crochet, and crochet is a different skill. It's a different art, and it might also use yarn, and it might also create some sort of fabric, but it is very different, and they are not same. They don't generate the same result, the same fabric. And there are a lot of other fiber arts out there that aren't knitting, and I don't know, it just seems to be like the most thing that people know, even the word of it. And especially I know that in some languages, like in Spanish, which is my first language, knitting and crochet are basically both the same word, and it's just what changes is if you say knitting with 2 needles or knitting with a hook. Basically, that's like the rough translation. So that I understand why that can be confusing, especially if you speak another language or come from a different culture. But I know how frustrating it is, as I crochet myself and I knit in 2. And people sometimes are like, oh, that's great knitting. I'm like, well, I made that with crochet. And people would say like, oh, who cares? Who cares which one is which? You're making things with yarn. Who's gonna remember? Who's gonna be able to tell them apart? It's very hard to tell which one's which. And to them I say, you would be upset if I said that football, soccer, baseball, and whatever other sport are the same thing. So it's the same thing. Each people has their different interests, and I think it's kind of rude when someone corrects you and tells you this is not what this is and this is actually what I'm doing, and you continue to call it that. That's just plain rude. It's fine, but correct yourself and learn. It's not that hard. Knitting is 2 needles. Crochet is a hook. And that takes us to another misconception that I've heard, which is that knitting is better than crochet, or that crochet is better than knitting. I think just from the get-go, saying that anything is better than anything else is just plain wrong. Like, nothing is better than each other. They're just different skills, like I said. It's kind of silly. And also especially because knitters and crocheters can really do things together. Like, a knitting group can have crocheters in them and vice versa. They are, in the end, fiber arts that both just use your hands and yarn. So I believe more into the community of everybody together rather than you versus me kind of situation. Don't like that. Another very, very common misconception is something that someone else sent, which is that knitting something is less expensive than purchasing a finished garment. I've actually had people tell me that, oh my gosh, you must save so much money on clothing because you knit. I think that probably also comes from, there was, once upon a time, it was cheaper to get the raw material and make things yourself. But of course, if you don't take into account the actual manual labor and hours and time that is put into making something, but just looking at the materials themselves, there was a time where they might have been cheaper than clothing. But that was when clothing was not, made en masse, and fast fashion wasn't a thing, and we were using better quality fibers, and things were being made not overseas, etc., etc., etc. So all of these things that made clothing cost whatever the value was, then the quality it came with. So of course, making something by hand was a little cheaper than that. I don't think it probably was ever super much cheaper, because yarn has always, had value. Yeah, it is not true. If you want to get into knitting, let me tell you something. It is not cheap. It is not cheap. People don't realize how much yarn you need to knit something. I had people like give me like one skein of yarn and be like, you can make a sweater. And I'm like, no, I can't, but thank you. People don't really realize how much yarn goes into something. So even very inexpensive yarn from a craft store, you do have to buy like 5, 6, or 7 skeins just to make something. So in the end, you end up spending way more than you would expect. And again, especially because of fast fashion and how the world is right now, a lot of things are very, very cheap and cheaply made and cheap materials.
Quality craftsmanship.
Oh. And a lot of people don't consider the time and effort put into things, which is also has a value. And I always say, like, something that maybe I spent $200 on the yarn, then you gotta add another like $300 of the time and effort, depending on how big it is. So yeah, knitting isn't cheap. There are ways of being on a budget, buying secondhand yarn or getting yarn gifted. I see a lot of people doing that. A lot of people that exchange yarn, or the de-stash, meaning selling yarn from their stash at cheaper costs. All of that stuff is ways of keeping yourself in a budget. But as our general rule, knitting is not a cheap hobby or art at all. And for some reason, people think that it is cheap to knit and cheap to make things. I guess that goes to another misconception that was submitted, which I'm gonna read this one. When I thought of hand knitting, I used to think of that awful 1980s acrylic yarn or a really itchy virgin wool. Thankfully, yarn has come a long way. There are so many soft and light options now. So I think that's another misconception. I've heard a lot of people tell me like, oh, I could never knit because wool is so itchy. I could never wear wool. not knowing that there probably is wool in some of the clothes that they already own, and that wool, the itchy wool, natural unprocessed wool that they're thinking of, is not really what I'm knitting with usually, or what you would wear close to your skin anymore, because maybe at some point it was, but yarn, like this person says, has come a long way, and there are a lot of different options, and wool isn't even the only fiber that you can work with. Of course, there's acrylic, and acrylic has also come a long way, I gotta say, probably from the original acrylic in the 80s to options that we have now. But there's also, like I said, other fibers. There's alpaca, there's cotton, there's linen, there's cashmere. There's so many different fibers, different types of wool, and of course different weights of wool, meaning how thick your wool is and how that affects what you make and how processed it is. There's just like, yarn is a whole world, and people can have two hobbies. They can knit and they can buy yarn. There's completely two different things. But yeah, there's another really big myth that people have this idea of what wool is, and maybe once upon a time they had this one woolen thing that was very itchy, and that's where their mind stayed, and oh my god, I could never have wool again, or just something knitted, even if it doesn't even use wool. Like, that's kind of ingrained in their perception of it, and it's not true at all. And then the last common misconception that I'm going to touch on today is also submitted by someone, and it says that I could sell my knits, people would spend so much money on these things, you should sell them, etc., etc. I also get that a lot, or people either saying, do you sell them, or would you sell them, or you really should sell what you make. And I respect that some people actually do make a business out of their actual knitting that they do, and it just seems like a lot of work and definitely a commitment. And personally, I knit because I enjoy doing it. And me sharing videos with you, or making patterns and sharing that, or posting pictures and videos about the stuff that I make, is really an extension of that love that I have for knitting. Personally, I am not interested in making a huge profit out of it, especially not of something that I make. And on top of that, I don't think people would pay what things are worth. Like I said earlier, people have no idea how much things that are knitted are actually worth, both because of the materials and the time spent on making them. So it is not really connected to reality, because I don't think that people would buy what I would sell, and I don't want to sell it. That's not my goal. That's not something I want to do. I knit because I want to, and it's hard to live in a hustle culture where everything that you do, every skill that you have to somehow get so good at it that you start making money out of it. And I think it's fine to just enjoy something. It's also fine not to be the best at it. Like, you can just knit, and maybe you don't knit the most amazing thing ever. Maybe it doesn't win any awards or want people to buy it, but you enjoy it making it, and you enjoy having it and using it. And I think that's all that matters. I think it's a very, way of thinking of you gotta make money out of everything you do. And you don't have to make money out of anything. You don't have to be perfect at everything, and sometimes you can do something just because you enjoy it, and that's all the value to bring into your life. Not monetary value, not economical, anything, just enjoyment. So I will leave you with that knitting is for everyone. Knitting is not cheap, but knitting can make you feel so fulfilled and happy, and it doesn't have to be a business in order for you to feel that way. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any other knitting myths that you have heard in the past, please put them in the comments so we can debunk them all for anyone else watching. And stay tuned for other videos about knitting patterns, sewing patterns, vintage knitting, and a lot more. Subscribe if you want to see more of that, and happy knitting!